We need to talk about the Epstein files. Trust me, I don't want to. I don't think I ever have, in fact. But because the conspiracies never seem to go away and new ones seem to take shape, I feel that I will try and do my best to talk about the Epstein files in totality now that people are floating ridiculous conspiracies that Putin controlled everything. Now, I'm going to be using some logic and critical thinking, so if that's not your jam, then go ahead and swipe away. And my primary focus will, of course, be Trump. Now, apparently, Putin, as that is the new sensational talking point that is being floated out in the social media spaces after the release of this 3.5 million documents that were released, and Putin's name appeared 1,000 times, and Moscow appeared almost 10,000 times. Now, people hear that a name appears in Epstein-related material tens, hundreds, and thousands of times, and immediately they assign guilt. While this is understandable, it is also wrong. A name doesn't repeat an investigation because they committed crimes. A name repeats an investigation because the investigators are looking for connections, not conclusions. If you're mapping a network, the most visible, documented, and litigated individual will appear numerous times. Not because they're the worst actors, but because they leave the largest paper trail. Now take Jeffrey Epstein. He wasn't running a secret society. He was running a social club. A very sick social club, but at the end of the day, it was a sick social club for elites. In fact, he communicated obsessively. Emails, call logs, calendar invites, staff instructions, flight manifests. He had scheduling notes, probably a diary. He communicated with lawyers, pilots, assistants. All of it generated metadata. So when a name appears repeatedly, it often means one of three things. The person was frequently referenced, but not necessarily there. The person was used as social media leverage, or the person was mentioned in third-party communications and not a direct contact. Repetition is a function of data gravity, not moral weight. Now here's where Donald Trump enters the story. Trump stands out in the Epstein documents not because he's uniquely involved, but because he's uniquely documented. Trump was a public figure long before politics, he was litigious, and he was media saturated. And yes, he was socially adjacent to Jeffrey Epstein in the early 90s in both Manhattan and Palm Beach, Florida. This was until they broke up later, or rather in the early 2000s. Epstein talked about Trump, Epstein referenced Trump, Epstein invoked Trump. That alone caused Trump's name to occur numerous times in notes, emails, and discussions. And that falling out I mentioned earlier is exactly what conspiracy theorists like to skip over, is that Epstein lost access to Trump at that point in time. There is zero evidence that Trump visited Epstein Island, and there is zero evidence that they maintained communication after their falling out in the early 2000s. If anything, that caused Epstein to become his own version of TDS, or Trump deranged. And that matters because Epstein targeted people in two ways. Those that he could access and those names that carried power. And a name can be a powerful tool even when access to them is no longer reachable. Now compare that with the people Epstein actually communicated with directly and repeatedly. Ghislaine Maxwell, recruiter of young women and his operational core. The former and disgraced Prince Andrew. Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's plane and visited his island numerous times. Alan Dershowitz, his lawyer, and apparently also visited the island. Les Wexner, where Epstein apparently got all his money from. Brunel, who apparently was directly tied to recruiting. Democrat George Mitchell, at one time a Senate Majority Leader. Democrat Bill Richardson, a former governor and UN ambassador. Democrat Stacey Plaskett, U.S. House delegate to the Virgin Islands. And Steve Bannon, former Trump insider who is no longer associated with Trump or the administration. Why does Trump's name still dominate the headlines whenever referenced to Epstein? Now, of course, the simple answer is TDS, or Trump derangement syndrome. But let's break it down a little further. Trump, he's polarizing, and he's symbolic, and he's already perceived as transgressive. So when a document dump happens, his name becomes the gravitational center. Not because it proves wrongdoing, to the contrary, it proves no wrongdoing. But what it also does is it attempts to prove cognitive bias. And repetition feeds that illusion. 5 mentions become 50, 50 become 100, and 100 becomes 1,000. But volume is not evidence, context is. If Epstein truly possessed compromising material on Trump, we would have seen such things as sustained access or financial leverage, recorded cooperation or behavioral compliance, but none of this existed. If anything, it kept revealing that Epstein was obsessed with Trump. But what does exist is something far more uncomfortable and far less cinematic, and that is the institutional silence around all of this. And here, sadly, is where the conversation usually breaks down. Because if repetition truly equaled guilt, and the Epstein files really had the smoking gun, then the question wouldn't be why does Trump's name appear so much? The question would be why the Biden administration didn't pursue release of these files at any time during his administration. And the legal restraints notwithstanding, I'm not talking about procedure. I'm talking about a concerted effort or a vocal push from the administration. You don't find one. There was never a time where Biden or anyone in his administration stood on the podium and said, we need to get these files released. They never once mentioned it. There was no public transparency release. There was no push by the DOJ to quickly get them released due to the smoking gun material that was going to be inside them. And if only the public could see it. I mean, it would have been very reminiscent of what Adam Schiff had done with the intelligence that he saw that absolutely proved collusion, and then it turned out that he was lying the entire time. But the reason why the Biden administration didn't pursue anything wasn't because they thought it wasn't politically useful, but it's because institutions don't expose systems that implicate themselves. Silence did not come from one man or one party. It came from institutional self-preservation. And that is also the real reason the Trump administration botched the release of the files. That is the real scandal. So to be clear, it's not just Trump or Biden, it's the fact that the elites were protecting themselves. And we all knew that. And the release of these latest documents prove that, as the name repetition is being replaced for guilt versus just noise. And so at some point, repetition stopped meaning reference and started meaning guilt. And so that's the intellectual trap and the new conspiracy theory that Putin was running everything. People hear that Vladimir Putin's name is mentioned in the Epstein files 1,000 times and immediately leap to a nefarious conspiracy theory. Epstein is now a Kremlin asset, compromising pipelines are established. And here we are again, secret leverage flows straight into the Trump administration. And while it sounds compelling, it also sounds extremely exhausting, as we've been here before, and that was also a lie. But more importantly, it collapses the moment you apply adult reasoning. Epstein name-dropped power constantly. In this case, he name-dropped Putin all the time. High-profile figures generate mentions without ever generating relationships. Putin is one of the most referenced people on the entire planet. His name appears in millions of documents where he had zero involvement. Do you see what I mean? Conspiracy theory fails immediately because intelligence services don't outsource their collection capabilities to flamboyant financiers. Epstein attracted lawsuits, victims, press, and criminal exposure. Why would the KGB put themselves at risk like that? Second, there is no financial exhaust. There is no money transfer between Moscow and Epstein, and everybody already knows who his financier was. It was this guy. Trump also showed no behavioral indicators of compromising control. And while Trump may have appeared diplomatic to Putin during his first term, he also made life for Putin extremely difficult. He sanctioned Russia, he armed Ukraine, he expelled Democrats, he warned Europe of their foolish behavior, friendly behavior to Russian resources. He withdrew from treaties and authorized strikes on Russian proxies. Frankly, Putin didn't gain any advantage of having Trump in the White House. In fact, he gained more of an advantage once Trump was out of it and utilized a very weak Biden to invade Ukraine. Since then, Trump has made NATO stronger while simultaneously saving the American taxpayer dollars from flowing into Ukraine and forcing the European Union to pick up the tab. And most importantly, Epstein lost access to Trump early. He talked more about Trump than he actually talked to Trump. And that's the difference between leverage and storytelling. On top of that, it was the Trump administration that put Epstein in prison. And I'm sure I'm not saying anything that you didn't already know at this point, but just in case you didn't know, all of those reports in the Epstein files that do reference Trump's name, that have specific stories behind them, those are raw reports that are fed to the FBI by anonymous sources. And anybody can do this. You could do this right now and make it completely anonymous and not get in trouble for it. And given the numerous scandals that the Democrats have rolled out as truth to the American public over the last 10 plus years, why is this any different? The real scandal here isn't that names repeat, it's that the system and the public have allowed repetition to replace truth, just like the gossip queens in high school. And once you see that, the fog lifts. And if you don't, then you're stuck in your cognitive bias and your TDS. We need to talk about the Epstein files. Trust me, I don't want to. I don't think I